Number 5. Richard Evonitz. There are men who commit crimes, and then there are men who seem to exist outside the normal boundaries of human behavior, as if something fundamental is missing from their architecture.
Richard Evonitz arrived at Red Onion State Prison carrying a weight that most inmates couldn't comprehend. On the surface, he looked unremarkable. Average height, quiet voice, the kind of man you'd pass on a street and immediately forget. That was precisely what made him so disturbing. Evonitz had lived a double life in Spotsylvania County, Virginia for years. A Navy veteran, a seemingly ordinary neighbor. But behind closed doors, he was responsible for the abductions and murders of 3 young girls, Sophia Silva and sisters Kristen and Katie Lisk. Crimes that shattered entire communities and left investigators questioning how someone could function so normally in plain sight for so long. What haunted law enforcement wasn't just what he had done, it was how long he had done it. Undetected, undisturbed, hiding in the open.
When Evonitz eventually ended his own life in Florida after a final abduction attempt in 2002, investigators were left with something worse than a trial. They were left with questions. How many others? How many cases remained unconnected? The answers have never fully arrived. But inside Red Onion's institutional memory, among the guards who processed his case files and the inmates familiar with his name, Evonitz represents something specific: the horror of the ordinary, the demon who wore a human face so convincingly that nobody looked twice. Corrections officers who studied his behavioral profile noted something that appears in the records with quiet consistency. He never expressed what most clinicians would recognize as guilt. Not the absence of remorse in the way violent offenders sometimes perform, but something more fundamental: a genuine blankness, as if the emotional circuitry simply wasn't there. Fellow inmates, even hardened ones, reportedly avoided extended conversation with men like Evonitz, not because of physical threat, but because of something they couldn't articulate: a feeling. The sense that when you looked into his eyes, nothing looked back. Prison psychologists have a clinical term for this pattern, but the inmates who encountered it had their own vocabulary. They called it the hollow. A man with no bottom, no floor, just depth that kept going. And the most unsettling part? Evonitz was considered, by almost every behavioral metric, to be cooperative, calm, manageable. Which raises the question that no report has ever satisfactorily answered. If this is what cooperative looks like, what were the ones who fought the system hiding beneath the surface? The next name on this list might begin to answer that. Number 4. Charles Severance. Some men frighten you because of what they've done. Charles Severance frightened people because of what he believed. When Severance arrived at Red Onion State Prison following his 2015 conviction for 3 execution-style murders in Alexandria, Virginia, staff had already been briefed. The psychological evaluations, the court transcripts, the years of erratic public behavior that had preceded the killings. They thought they were prepared. They were not. Severance had been a ghost in Alexandria for years, a former political candidate who had spiraled into what observers described as a profound, consuming paranoia. He believed Alexandria's establishment had conspired against him, that powerful forces had stolen his life, his opportunities, his future. And over the course of what prosecutors argued was a years-long campaign of retribution, 3 people were shot dead in their own homes: Ann Lodato, Ron Kirby, and Nancy Dunning, all connected, however loosely, to the Alexandria community
Severance had come to despise. The murders were methodical, spaced years apart, leaving almost nothing behind. What made investigators most uneasy wasn't the killings themselves. It was the patience, the ability to wait, to plan across years, to remain quiet and invisible while carrying something enormous inside. Inside Red Onion, that patience didn't disappear. It transformed. Guards described Severance as a presence that was difficult to categorize. He wasn't violent in the conventional sense. He wasn't erratic in the way facilities prepare for. Instead, he was relentlessly internal, consuming books, writing prolifically, constructing elaborate frameworks of thought that staff found deeply unsettling to engage with. Inmates who encountered him in limited common settings reported that conversations with Severance felt like entering a maze. He was articulate, even compelling, but the logic underneath was structured around a reality that didn't quite match the one everyone else inhabited. A parallel architecture. And he navigated it with complete conviction. What disturbed staff most was a pattern documented in behavioral reports. Severance had an ability to identify grievances in other people almost immediately. He could find the wound in a person's psychology and speak directly to it, not as manipulation exactly, but as recognition. As if he saw in others the same engine of perceived injustice that drove him. In a maximum security environment filled with men carrying deep grievances, that ability was considered quietly dangerous. One senior corrections officer, speaking generally about inmates of this psychological profile, once noted, "The ones who scare you aren't always the ones making noise. Sometimes it's the ones who make you feel understood." Severance made people feel understood. And that was the part nobody could quite explain away. Because understanding, in the right hands, is a form of power. The question that lingered in the unit log notes and informal staff conversations wasn't whether Severance was dangerous. It was whether he knew exactly how dangerous he was. What comes next on this list moves us further from the political, further from the ideological, and into something more primal. Something that left even experienced forensic investigators struggling to find language adequate to the reality they were documenting. Number 3. Joseph Michael Giarratano. Some demons are not what they appear to be. And that ambiguity, the inability to be certain, is its own particular form of horror. Joseph M. Giarratano was born August 26, 1957. In 1979, he was convicted of the rape and strangulation murder of 15-year-old Michelle Klein and the stabbing murder of her mother, Barbara Ann Tony Klein, in Norfolk, Virginia. Crimes to which he confessed multiple times and for which he was sentenced to death. The facts of the case, however, have never been clean. Giarratano was a scallop boat fisherman who also smuggled drugs. He said he woke up from a drug and alcohol-induced stupor to find the bodies and fled to Florida before turning himself in. He walked into a Jacksonville bus station and told a deputy sheriff that he thought he might have killed 2 people. Might have. Over the course of the investigation, Giarratano gave a total of 5 confessions, which were inconsistent with one another and conflicted with the evidence at the crime scene. Footprints, fingerprints, and pubic hairs recovered at the scene did not match either Giarratano or the victims. Experts indicated the killer was right-handed. Giarratano is left-handed. His confessions were so inconsistent that detectives told him they did not believe him, and, he said, provided him with detailed information that he then parroted back to them
in his 5th confession. A trial that lasted half a day. A death sentence. Inside Virginia's prison system, something unusual began to happen. The man convicted of one of the most brutal crimes on Virginia's death row began to transform. Not into a penitent, not into a broken shell, but into something the system had no category for. A scholar, a legal strategist, a force. Joe Giarratano's Red Onion State Prison address, 118475, became the return address for legal arguments that reached the highest courts in the land. Giarratano became noted as a legal scholar, published in the Yale Law Journal. He assisted other prisoners with their cases, seeking to widen prisoners' rights, including the right to counsel, with an argument approved by the Federal Court of Appeals. He helped save the life of Earl Washington, Jr., an intellectually disabled man who came within 9 days of execution for a crime DNA evidence later proved he didn't commit. Giarratano was involved in a 1984 escape attempt with 7 other men from Mecklenburg Prison, though he did not flee himself. He was later stabbed by another inmate. It was later reported that he was transferred to a Utah supermax because the Virginia Corrections Director had a politically hot prisoner that he wanted to get rid of. The system transferred him. It brought him back. It denied him parole 9 consecutive times. In 1991, 2 days before Giarratano was scheduled to die in the electric chair, Governor L. Douglas Wilder commuted his sentence to life, recommending a new trial. The state attorney general refused. He remained in prison. Poor medical care in prison resulted in the loss of his right leg. During those 38 years, 38 prisoners were executed. I knew almost all of them, he said. When I think about that, it makes me angry. In 2017, after his 10th parole consideration, the Virginia State Parole Board voted to grant him release, 38 years after he entered the system. He died on October 6, 2024. Free. Pardoned by time, if not by law. Here is the question that lingers in the corridors of Red Onion, in the cells where his name was once spoken with a mixture of reverence and unease. If Joseph Giarratano was innocent, if the footprints, the fingerprints, the handedness, the collapsing confessions all point to a man who didn't do it, then who killed Michelle and Tony Klein in that Norfolk apartment in 1979? In 2004, the state announced it could not find any of the physical evidence collected from the crime scene. Norfolk and Virginia authorities have maintained that the biological evidence in Giarratano's case was destroyed years ago. The evidence is gone. The man is gone. The question remains. Number 2. Kyle Hulbert. There are men who commit violence out of rage. There are men who commit violence out of calculation. And then there is Kyle Hulbert, a man who committed violence out of something altogether harder to categorize. Something that existed in the space between delusion and devotion, between a fractured mind and a 27-inch steel blade. On December 8, 2001, Robert Schwartz, a 57-year-old nationally renowned biophysicist and founding member of the Virginia Biotechnology Association, was stabbed multiple times with a 27-inch sword at his secluded farmhouse in Leesburg, Loudoun County, Virginia. Whoever had done it carved an X into the back of his neck before leaving. His body was found 2 days later. His coworkers had reported him missing. The investigation that followed would reveal something that even seasoned homicide detectives struggled to fully process. Not because the facts were complicated, but because the internal logic of the people involved operated in a universe that didn't map to the one everyone else inhabited. At the center of the plot was Schwartz's 19-year-old daughter, Clara Jane Schwartz, a James Madison University student obsessed with online fantasy role-playing games involving vampires and demons. She had been referring to her father in online messages as Vampire, her designated enemy, for months before his death. And the man she recruited to carry out the killing was Kyle Hulbert. Hulbert fixated on his own world. Seated in the back of a car on the night of the murder, next to his 27-inch steel shinobi sword, he cradled a constant companion that only he could see, a dragon named Tiamat. She curled up cat-like in his lap, black with red marks outlining the bones along her wings, eyes the palest green. In his head, he listened to voices debating whether the whole universe could be Kyle's dream.
Hulbert had a long history of mental illness and had spent much of his childhood in mental institutions. He had constructed a fantasy world in which he saw himself as a protector of the downtrodden. When Clara came to him with her story of a poisoning father, of abuse, of fear, Hulbert's internal architecture of duty and protection engaged completely. He went to the farmhouse. He knocked on the door. Robert Schwartz let him in. Hulbert attacked Schwartz with the 27-inch sword, stabbing him more than 50 times. He carved an X into Schwartz's neck before leaving. Then he got back in the car, drove away, and spoke to the dragon on his lap about what had just happened. At trial, the psychological portrait that emerged was one of the most genuinely unsettling documented in Virginia's modern court history. Not because Hulbert was calculating, but because he wasn't. He was sincere. Completely, totally, absolutely sincere. He believed he had done the right thing. He believed in Clara's story. He believed in the dragon. He believed in his code of honor,
which he had written out. Honor goes before all. Then loyalty. Violate honor not at any time. Honor and protect love at all costs. After his arrest, sitting in the county jail, Hulbert had nightmares, replays of murdering Schwartz. He saw Robert Schwartz's face in his dreams. The face was grinning. At sentencing, Hulbert apologized to the Schwartz family and said he thought what he was doing was right. He said, "There is nothing I wouldn't give to take that act back. I allowed myself to be poisoned by Clara." His attorney told the court, she was the puppet master. Kyle Hulbert was the puppet. Kyle Hulbert was sentenced to life in prison. He is now a grown man, having spent his entire adult life incarcerated in Virginia's prison system, moving through its facilities, carrying with him a psychology that forensic evaluators at the time of his trial could not fully categorize. Not psychotic in the legal sense, not malingering, genuinely, structurally different in the way he processed reality, loyalty, and violence. The dragon on his lap, the code of honor, the voices debating whose dream the universe was. Inside Virginia's maximum security system, Kyle Hulbert has had 2 decades to sit with what he did, and with whatever internal world still exists behind his eyes. In letters from prison, he has written about redemption, about wanting to help people, about the weight of what happened in that farmhouse. But here is the question that his case leaves permanently open. A man who committed an act of profound violence because his internal world, his loyalty codes, his dragons, his voices, overrode every other signal available to him. What does that internal world look like now? After 20 years of solitary reflection inside Virginia's hardest institutions, has it quieted? Or has it simply grown more elaborate? Number 1. Lee Boyd Malvo.
For 3 weeks in October 2002, the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area stopped. People stopped pumping gas in the open. Schools locked their doors and canceled outdoor activities. Shoppers crouched behind their cars in parking lots. Ordinary citizens, people buying groceries, loading packages, filling their tanks, were being killed by a bullet from somewhere they couldn't see, couldn't locate, couldn't predict. In total, the snipers killed 17 people and wounded 10 others in a 10-month span. The killings began in February 2002 on the West Coast and moved steadily east. Each murder refined, each location chosen, each shot placed with the patience of people who were not hunting randomly, but practicing. Lee Boyd Malvo was born February 18, 1985, in Kingston, Jamaica. He was 17 during the span of the shootings. 17 years old.
That fact is simultaneously the most humanizing and the most disturbing element of this case. 17. Old enough to pull a trigger. Young enough that the courts would ultimately determine his brain was not yet fully formed. Young enough that the manipulation he was subjected to carries genuine clinical weight. John Allen Muhammad had told Malvo that the $10 million ransom sought from the U.S. government would be used to establish a utopian society for 140 homeless black children on a Canadian compound. Muhammad had built in the boy's mind an entire world, a purpose, a mission, a reason. And Malvo, abandoned by his parents, desperate for the father figure Muhammad presented, believed it. Muhammad had put a mattress in the back of his 1990 Chevy Caprice and carved a hole in the trunk. Following instructions for creating a sniper's nest he had found in an old IRA manual. From that trunk, that dark, confined, purpose-built space, Lee Boyd Malvo killed people who were doing nothing more than living ordinary moments of their lives.
As Stephanie Hooper testified, she and her husband Jeffrey had just finished a very nice dinner and were on their way home to Florida after visiting family. They had argued about who loved each other more. They held hands on the way to the curb. Before they went to their separate sides of the car, Jeffrey pulled Stephanie close and kissed her. And then a bullet ended him. That is what the DC sniper attacks were. Ordinary moments, interrupted permanently by a 17-year-old in a car trunk, following instructions from a man who had hollowed out his sense of self and filled the space with something else entirely. Muhammad was sentenced to death and executed by lethal injection in 2009. Malvo received 6 life sentences in Maryland and 3 in Virginia. For the past 22 years, Malvo was housed at Red Onion State Prison, classified as maximum security.
22 years. He arrived as a teenager. He spent his entire adult life, every formative year of his 20s and 30s, inside Red Onion's supermax walls. Whatever psychological growth, whatever reckoning, whatever reconstruction of self occurred in Lee Boyd Malvo happened in a cell with a steel slab, a food slot, and 23 hours of isolation per day. In 2007, Malvo called Cheryl Witz, the daughter of one of his victims, to apologize. In 2010, he wrote a letter to another survivor. "I am truly sorry for the pain I caused you and your loved ones." A Virginia judge denied Malvo's request to legally change his name in 2011. Malvo had petitioned on the basis that he would be safer if his fellow inmates did not know his real identity, due to his notoriety. Think about that. Inside Red Onion, a facility containing Virginia's most dangerous convicted criminals, Lee Boyd Malvo, the DC sniper, feared for his safety from the other inmates. In August 2023, Malvo filed a federal lawsuit accusing Red Onion officials of violating his constitutional rights
and knowingly putting his life at risk in retaliation for complaining about conditions.
Then, in June 2024, after 22 years, Malvo was transferred from Red Onion to the slightly lower security Keene Mountain Correctional Center, having demonstrated no disruptive behavior for at least 24 months. He stepped down. He left Red Onion. And here is the final unresolved note in the story of Lee Boyd Malvo. The thing that no court document, no parole hearing, no psychological evaluation has ever fully resolved. A note Malvo wrote before sentencing, anticipating the death penalty, read in part, "I'll be back, and next time whatsoever my endeavor is, I will not fail." He was 17. He was frightened. He was, forensic psychologists argue, still in the grip of Muhammad's influence. Context matters.
But the words exist, written in his hand. And now, he is out of Red Onion, back in the world, in a lower security facility, with parole hearings on the horizon. A man who once told the court he would not fail. A man who spent 22 years in the most isolated prison in Virginia, reconstructing himself in the silence. Who is Lee Boyd Malvo now? The system has made its determination. The families of 17 people, people who were kissing their spouses goodnight, people who were pumping gas, people who were simply alive in ordinary moments, are left to live with whatever answer comes next.